What can the U.S. do to the president? Secretary Kerry says that the U.S. is going to up its game in terms of cordoning off Iran in those other places. But what can they really do?
John, I think that the U.S. needs to do two things simultaneously. First, it does need to work with our Sunni Arab allies so that they're able to push back against Iranian expansion. The Sunnis say the Iranians are controlling 4 Arab capitals, Damascus, Baghdad, Sana'a in Yemen, Beirut. And so pushing back and resisting that is important, and the U.S. has to help them. That's really what the Camp David summit was about. At the same time, Secretary Kerry and the President believe strongly that there may be a door opening to a broader diplomatic dialogue, in part because of this new pressure from the Sunni side, that would lead the Iranians into, say, negotiations about Syria. But Bashar al-Assad, their client in Syria, is really on the ropes now. So Secretary Kerry hopes that the Russians will encourage a process where there's a negotiation for political transition. That sounds great, so long as you keep the pressure on. Because without the pressure, it's not going to work.
Is that Secretary Kerry's next job? I mean, he's got two things. He's got to sell Congress 60 days to pick this deal apart, but then he's also, as David points out, there's a lot of work to be done overseas for Secretary Kerry.
There is, and he's going to be heading to speak to some of the heads of the Gulf states in early August to try to sell this and back up some of the promises that were made at Camp David that you just mentioned. But Syria is the big test case for this because it is the place where you were seeing, Iran keep Bashar al-Assad in power, and you have seen the Obama administration very restrained and very concerned about what directly confronting Iran there could mean. So it's going to be interesting to see what those Arab Gulf states do if they actually, follow through in confrontation there.
2 quick points. One, President Obama sees ISIS as the real threat in the Middle East, not Iran. Let's just, I think that's fair. He does not to say that he discounts Iran entirely, but ISIS is the flamethrower.
And Iran now says, hey, now that we've done this, we can both join together and work against ISIS.
Which is a dubious proposition, but
and they say they're the most effective fighting force on the ground against ISIS.
It's a dubious proposition, but it's happening.
But it's already happening, right. It's just you make friends with the other. It's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing you're doing. But the second point is that there's an extremely long game here that I think President Obama won't talk about this extremely long game. But he does seem to believe that Iran could be at a tipping point. The population is pro-American. 30 years of living under the Ayatollahs will do that to you. And that maybe this will set in motion a virtuous cycle in which we see Iran rejoin the community of nations. He doesn't have a lot of faith in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states as true civilizations. We've seen that in some of his statements elliptically. And so he really does believe that we're that something is being set in motion here, that we won't see the fruits of that for a long time.
John, you made reference at the beginning to the Iranians dancing in the streets after the deal. And I just would note that the people dancing in the streets are not the hardliners. They are the Iranians who have been dreaming of joining the world. And over the long run, that's the thing that's working most in our advantage, that Iranians want to be part of the world that we live in, and they're a political force.
Right. They were happy the sanctions were gone, not happy that Iran's going to get a nuclear bomb later.
To be part of the world. They don't want just Russian.
They don't want to go fight and die in Syria on behalf of Bashar al-Assad.
Right.
But there is a symbolic importance to what you're saying that I think sometimes we miss as Americans, that the proximity of recent history to the Iranian public, they're looking back at all these years of mistrust, and they can read you a long list of where America has done them wrong. And to then be making some sort of rapprochement here and then being told, come back out of the cold into the world community means something. It has some significance to the public and certainly to Zarif.
David, what do you make of Secretary Kerry's analogy that this is just like the Soviet Union, where the United States would have arms deals with the Soviet Union, but also even Ronald Reagan calling them the evil empire, that you could work 2 tracks here? Does that work with Iran?
I think it does. We forget just how menacing the Soviet Union was at the time of the arms control deals, how menacing China was. China was, talking about general nuclear war at the time that Henry Kissinger and President Nixon engaged them. So this idea that you engage your adversaries and that over time that can have benefits in capping their behavior, history tells us that's real. I think it's a good analogy to draw. I wish Secretary Kerry didn't say the alternative to this deal is war, because we know from history, Russia and China, that isn't the alternative. It's a kind of cold stalemate, a bitter confrontation, but it's not necessarily war.
Although, to be fair, at this point, within the framework and the reality that the Obama administration and its allies have created for themselves, if Congress were to subvert this, override a veto, let's say, the chances are very slim that Iran and our negotiating partners are going to go back to the table and say, oh, well, Congress wants us to do X, Y, and Z now, after we agreed on this set of principles. So we would be slipping toward a kind of confrontation, which, of course, is what most of America's allies in the region, Israel and the Arabs, they won't say this as such, but they kind of hope that we would go back into a more confrontational mode.